There is a country in the Middle East that ranks among the top 5 richest places on Earth by GDP per capita. Its capital city is a skyline of glass towers rising from desert sand. Its citizens pay no income tax. They receive free healthcare and free university education. The government subsidizes their electricity and housing. They are given preferential access to business licenses and guaranteed employment in government roles. The children of this country are born into a standard of living that most of the world can barely imagine. Here is the thing nobody says out loud about this place. Most of the people living inside it are not actually from there. 94% of the workforce has no path to citizenship. Most cannot vote. Most cannot own property. Until very recently, most of them could not change jobs or leave the country without their employer's written permission. They build the stadiums, they staff the hotels, they drive the taxis and clean the towers and pour the concrete and work the gas fields. They produce almost all of the economic output that makes the GDP per capita number so spectacular. And almost none of the wealth that number implies actually belongs to them. This is Qatar, and it is the most extraordinary, uncomfortable, and misunderstood wealth story of the 21st century. To understand how extreme Qatar's transformation has been, you need to know what it was before the gas. For most of its history, the Qatar Peninsula was one of the most inhospitable and economically marginal places in the Arab world. A small finger of land jutting into the Persian Gulf, roughly the size of the state of Connecticut, Qatar had almost no agriculture, almost no fresh water, no forests, and no industry of any kind. The summer temperatures routinely exceeded 45 degrees Celsius. The soil grew almost nothing useful. The population scraped together a living through fishing and through one industry that, for a brief period in the late 19th and early 20th century, made the Gulf region matter to the world: pearl diving. Qatari pearl divers were legendary for their ability to free dive to extraordinary depths in the warm Gulf waters, surfacing with oysters that contained the perfectly formed natural pearls that wealthy buyers in India, Europe, and the Ottoman Empire were willing to pay enormous prices to obtain. At its peak, the pearl industry supported the entire population of the Gulf states and gave places like Qatar a degree of commercial significance they otherwise never would have possessed. The emir, the ruling Al Thani family, and the merchant families all depended on it. The towns that existed on the Qatari coast existed because of it. Then Japan introduced cultured pearls to the global market in the 1930s. Japanese researchers had discovered how to artificially induce oysters to produce pearls by inserting a small irritant. The resulting pearls were almost indistinguishable from natural ones, and they could be produced in enormous quantities at a tiny fraction of the cost of diving for natural oysters. The Gulf pearl industry, which had been the economic backbone of Qatar, Bahrain, and the surrounding area for generations, collapsed within a decade. By the 1940s, it was essentially gone. The pearl divers had nothing to do. The merchants who had financed the fleets had no business left. Qatar was, by almost any measure, one of the poorest and most economically hopeless territories on the planet. Oil had actually been discovered in Qatar as early as 1939, in a field called Dukhan on the western side of the peninsula. But the Second World War delayed development, and when oil production finally began in earnest in the 1940s, the quantities were modest compared to what neighboring Saudi Arabia was producing. Qatar was never going to be a major oil power. Its crude oil reserves were real but limited. For a while, it seemed like Qatar would be a minor, secondary player in the Gulf energy landscape, perpetually overshadowed by its much larger and richer neighbors. Qatar gained independence from Britain in 1971, and in that same year, 1971, something happened offshore that would eventually change everything, though nobody understood it at the time. Exploration engineers working in the waters of Qatar's northeastern coast discovered a massive underground formation of natural gas. It was enormous. Inconveniently enormous, actually, because nobody quite knew what to do with it. Natural gas in 1971 was a problem as much as an opportunity. You couldn't easily transport it the way you could ship oil in tankers. It either had to be piped directly to a nearby consumer, or it had to be converted into a liquid form, which required very expensive chilling technology, very expensive specialized ships, and buyers who were willing to sign long-term contracts to justify the extraordinary capital costs. Over the following years, appraisal wells were drilled, 15 of them in total, over more than a decade of careful study. And what those wells revealed, confirmed definitively by 1985, was something that even the most optimistic Qatari engineers had not fully anticipated. The gas field of Qatar's coast was not just large, it was the largest single non-associated natural gas field ever discovered in the world. The North Field, as it was named, contained recoverable reserves estimated at over 900 trillion standard cubic feet of natural gas. To put that in perspective, that single offshore field contains approximately 10% of the entire world's known gas reserves. The underground territory covered by the North Field is roughly equivalent in area to the entire land surface of Qatar itself. Qatar, a country that had struggled for centuries at the very margin of economic survival, was sitting on top of one of the most spectacular accumulations of fossil fuel wealth in human history. But here is the detail that separates Qatar's story from a simple tale of geological luck. Having the gas in the ground and actually converting it into national wealth are completely different problems. Between the confirmation of the North Field's scale in the mid-1980s and the moment Qatar first exported a cargo of gas to the world, there was a gap of approximately 10 years of difficult, expensive, politically complex preparation. And it took another decade after that for the full transformation to be complete. The critical decision was to commit to LNG, liquefied natural gas. The process of cooling natural gas to minus 162 degrees Celsius until it becomes liquid, reducing its volume by a factor of 600, loading it onto specialized refrigerated tankers, shipping it halfway around the world, and then regasifying it at the destination for the end consumer. In the 1980s, this technology existed, but was still relatively expensive and unproven at the scale Qatar would need. Every step of the process required enormous capital investment. The liquefaction plants, the port infrastructure at Ras Laffan on Qatar's northeastern coast, the fleet of specialized tankers, and most critically, the long-term purchase agreements with buyers willing to commit to buying Qatari gas for decades in advance, which was the financial foundation on which everything else depended. Qatar Gas was established by royal decree in 1984 as the vehicle to develop and market the North Field's gas. But it took 8 more years to sign the first sales agreement, and 12 years after Qatar Gas was founded before the first actual cargo of Qatari LNG sailed from Ras Laffan to Japan in December 1996. That was the moment the machine really started, and from that moment it never slowed down. Through the late 1990s and early 2000s, Qatar built train after train at Ras Laffan, each one a massive industrial complex that could liquefy billions of cubic feet of gas per day. New tankers were commissioned. Supply agreements were signed with buyers in Japan, South Korea, India, Britain, Belgium, Spain, and eventually across Europe and Asia. Qatar drove down the cost of LNG production systematically and aggressively, using economies of scale and technical innovation to make itself the cheapest and most reliable supplier in the world. By 2010, Qatar had become the single largest exporter of LNG on Earth. Today, it remains one of the top 2. The revenues that flowed from this were staggering in the context of Qatar's tiny population. Hydrocarbons now account for more than 70% of the government's total revenue, more than 60% of GDP, and roughly 85% of all export earnings. A country of 3 million people, 2/3 of whom are temporary migrant workers, was generating and accumulating wealth at a pace that made its per capita statistics look almost fictional. This is where the title of this video requires a direct explanation, because the number that usually gets cited when people discuss Qatar's wealth conceals something important. Qatar's GDP per capita, the total economic output divided by the total population, places it consistently among the top 4 or 5 richest countries in the world, ahead of the United States, ahead of Germany, ahead of almost every country you could name. But that number is calculated by dividing the GDP by the roughly 3 million people living inside Qatar's borders. And of those 3 million people, only approximately 300,000 are Qatari citizens. The other 2.7 million, which as of June 2026 represents more than 94% of the entire workforce, are migrant workers and foreign expatriates. They are from Nepal, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, the Philippines, Kenya, Egypt, and dozens of other countries. They work in construction, domestic service, hospitality, transportation, and across every sector of the Qatari economy. Without them, Qatar could not function for a single day. The skyline of Doha, every stadium, every hotel, every road, every piece of infrastructure was built by their hands. The economy would stop tomorrow if they left. But those 2.7 million people share almost none of the citizenship benefits that make Qatar's GDP per capita number sound so spectacular. They pay taxes in their home countries, not Qatar, but they also receive none of the services that Qatari citizens receive. They do not have access to free university education in Qatar. They do not receive government housing assistance. They cannot own property. They cannot vote. They have no path to permanent residency and certainly no path to citizenship, regardless of how long they live and work in the country. When a migrant worker's contract ends, they go home. Qatar's citizenship is essentially inherited. It passes through bloodlines, not through residence, contribution, or achievement. So when people say Qatar has a GDP per capita of roughly $68,000, what they're really saying is that Qatar produces roughly $68,000 of economic output per person living there. But the actual experience of that wealth, the tax-free income, the free education, the subsidized housing, the government business preferences, the ability to own land and vote and have a political voice, all of that belongs to the 300,000 Qatari nationals, not to the 3 million people doing most of the work that generates the output. Qatar is, in a very precise sense, a country whose GDP per capita statistic is calculated using the total population, but whose wealth is experienced by a fraction of it. For those 300,000 people who are actual Qatari nationals, the country provides a level of material comfort that is almost without parallel anywhere in the world. There is no personal income tax. Qatari citizens pay nothing to the state from their salaries or investment income. Free healthcare is provided by a national health system funded entirely by gas revenues. Free education runs from kindergarten through university, and the government covers the cost of studying abroad for citizens who want to pursue degrees at international institutions. Electricity, water, and housing are subsidized to such a degree that basic costs are almost nominal. The state has historically guaranteed employment to Qatari nationals who want it, particularly in government and semi-government roles. Qatari nationals are given priority in business licensing and are required by law to hold a majority stake in any commercial venture in the country. The ruling Al Thani family, which has governed Qatar for most of its modern history, presides over a form of social contract that is almost the mirror image of a typical Western democracy. In most democracies, citizens pay taxes and, in exchange, they expect the government to provide services and be accountable for how it spends the money. In Qatar, the government provides the services and asks almost nothing financially in return, funded instead by the gas that flows from the North Field. Political rights in the conventional democratic sense are limited. The emir holds nearly all executive, legislative, and judicial authority. The Shura Council, Qatar's consultative assembly, was partially elected for a period but returned to a fully appointed model in 2024. The implicit understanding of the Qatari social contract is not votes in exchange for services, but rather stability and comfort in exchange for political deference. The contrast between the experience of the 300,000 citizens and the experience of the 2.7 million migrants is the central moral tension of Qatar's wealth story. For decades, the lives of migrant workers in Qatar were governed by a system called kafala, which means sponsorship in Arabic. Under kafala, a migrant worker's visa was tied directly to a specific employer. The employer became the worker's legal sponsor, and the implications of this arrangement were sweeping. Workers could not change jobs without their sponsor's permission. They could not leave Qatar without their sponsor's permission. If a sponsor refused to grant permission to leave and the worker tried anyway, they could be arrested and deported. Workers who fled abusive employers became illegal overstayers in the country. In the worst cases that were documented by human rights organizations over many years, the kafala system enabled a pattern of abuses that courts and advocacy groups described in stark terms. Passports were confiscated by employers, making it physically impossible for workers to travel or prove their identity without their employer's cooperation. Wages were withheld for months. Workers who had paid substantial recruitment fees in their home countries, often equivalent to many months of the salary they had been promised, arrived in Qatar already in debt and unable to afford to go home, even if they had been legally permitted to do so. Living conditions for lower-wage workers in industrial camps were documented by investigators as genuinely harsh. Overcrowded dormitories, inadequate food, dangerous temperatures in summer. Qatar spent more than $200 billion preparing for the 2022 FIFA World Cup, building 7 new stadiums from scratch, constructing an entire metro system, expanding the airport, and building new hotels, roads, and commercial infrastructure across the country. The scale of this construction project required an enormous workforce drawn from across South Asia and East Africa. When international attention on Qatar intensified in the years before the tournament, the conditions of the workers who were building it became the subject of sustained global scrutiny. Qatar's World Cup Organizing Committee Secretary General acknowledged that approximately 400 to 500 workers had died in the broader infrastructure build connected to the tournament, though the precise count and attribution of deaths across different projects remained disputed. Qatar did respond with reforms, initially slowly and then more substantially under sustained pressure. In 2020, the kafala system was legally dismantled. Workers gained the right to change jobs and leave the country without requiring employer permission. A minimum wage was introduced in 2021, applicable to all workers regardless of nationality, set at 1,000 Qatari riyals per month, approximately $275, plus mandatory stipends for housing and food if the employer does not provide them directly. Outdoor labor was prohibited during the hottest hours of summer days. Labor courts were established to adjudicate wage disputes. Qatar's Ministry of Labor reported paying approximately $271 million through a workers' support and insurance fund in 2022 alone. Human rights organizations have acknowledged these changes, while noting that significant implementation gaps remain in practice, and that workers still cannot form unions or strike. While the migrant worker story represents Qatar's most visible global controversy, the Qatar Investment Authority represents its most ambitious long-term strategy. The QIA was established in 2005 to do for Qatar what Norway's government pension fund had done for Norway. Take the finite revenue from fossil fuels and convert it into permanent financial assets spread across the global economy, so that when the gas eventually runs out, Qatar's wealth doesn't run out with it. With approximately $526 billion in assets under management as of late 2024, the QIA is one of the top 10 largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. Its investment footprint is deliberately visible and deliberately global. It owns Harrods, the famous London department store, purchased from Mohammed Al Fayed in 2010. It owns a significant stake in the Canary Wharf Group, one of London's major business districts. It owns the Shard, the glass pyramid tower that is one of London's most recognizable modern landmarks. It holds a stake in Heathrow Airport, through which millions of passengers pass every year. It owns Paris Saint-Germain, the French football club, whose roster has at various points included some of the most famous players in the world. It holds stakes in Volkswagen, the German car manufacturer. It invested billions into Barclays during the 2008 financial crisis, helping the bank avoid UK government bailout. It has made investments in Credit Suisse, Iberdrola, the Spanish energy company, and dozens of other significant global businesses. The strategy is explicit and logical. Qatar cannot export its gas forever. The North Field's reserves are vast but ultimately finite. Every billion cubic feet that leaves Ras Laffan on a tanker, is 1 billion cubic feet that will never come back. The QIA's mandate is to ensure that by the time the gas runs thin, Qatar holds financial stakes in enough of the world's productive capacity that the income from those investments replaces the income from the gas. The fund is Qatar's plan for the century after LNG. In this sense, it follows the same logic as Norway's oil fund, though with notably less transparency in how it reports performance and holdings, and with a significant additional dimension. Qatar uses its investment portfolio not just as a financial vehicle, but as a tool of diplomatic engagement and international influence. The purchase of PSG gave Qatar a globally followed football club and inserted it into the cultural consciousness of hundreds of millions of European fans. The investment in Barclays during the financial crisis built deep goodwill and relationships with British financial institutions and the British government. The investments in European energy companies give Qatar long-term ties to the continent's energy establishment, at a moment when European governments are desperately seeking alternatives to Russian gas. Qatar signed a 27-year LNG supply deal with Germany in 2022, in the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the disruption of European energy supplies. Money and diplomacy in Qatar are not separate activities. They are the same activity. In June 2017, 4 Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt, suddenly severed diplomatic and economic ties with Qatar and imposed a land, sea, and air blockade. The stated reasons involved Qatar's alleged support for various Islamist movements and its relationship with Iran, but the underlying dynamics reflected long-running tensions about Qatar's independent foreign policy, its hosting of Al Jazeera, the pan-Arab news network it had launched in 1996, and its willingness to engage with actors that its larger Gulf neighbors considered adversaries. The blockade was designed to be economically crippling. Saudi Arabia was Qatar's only land border. Qatari goods and travelers had routinely passed through Saudi territory. The UAE's ports had handled significant Qatari cargo. Almost overnight, Qatar was cut off from its traditional supply routes for food, which it had historically imported in large quantities from its neighbors and through them. The blockade failed to bring Qatar to its knees, and in some ways made it significantly stronger. Turkey airlifted food supplies and moved quickly to establish a military base in Qatar, providing a security guarantee. Iran opened its airspace for Qatari flights, giving the small country a route around its blocked neighbors. Qatar accelerated investment in domestic food production, expanding greenhouse agriculture, dairy farming, and aquaculture to reduce dependence on imports. The experience of the blockade forced Qatar to confront vulnerabilities it had previously ignored, and to address them with the kind of capital investment that its gas revenues made readily available. By the time the blockade formally ended in January 2021, Qatar had emerged more food self-sufficient, more militarily supported, and arguably more diplomatically sophisticated than it had been in 2017. There is a number that sits at the center of Qatar's wealth narrative and deserves to be examined carefully. Qatar's GDP per capita ranks it among the world's richest countries. But GDP per capita is a mathematical calculation, total output divided by total population. It says nothing about how the wealth is distributed. In Qatar's case, the wealth distribution between Qatari citizens and migrant workers is not just unequal, it is structurally separated by citizenship, by law, and by the fundamental design of the economy. The 300,000 Qatari citizens live in a welfare state funded by gas revenues that no taxation is required to sustain. They receive benefits that would be the envy of citizens in far wealthier democracies. They are, in very concrete terms, among the most materially privileged people on earth. The 2.7 million migrant workers living alongside them in the same physical space, generating the same economic output that makes the GDP number so impressive, live in an entirely different Qatar. They come, they work, they send money home, and they leave. Qatar is not their future, it is their job. This is what the title of this video means. The richest country nobody actually lives in is not a criticism exactly, it is a description. The people who generate Qatar's extraordinary GDP per capita statistic are overwhelmingly people for whom Qatar is a temporary assignment, not a home. The people for whom Qatar is genuinely home, the Qatari citizens who inherited the wealth of the North Field, are fewer than 300,000. In terms of permanent, rooted, invested residents, Qatar is nearly empty. What fills the space are workers on contracts, living on temporary terms, in the world's richest country by a statistic that includes them numerically, while excluding them practically from everything the statistic implies. Today, if you fly into Hamad International Airport in Doha, which is itself ranked among the best airports in the world, you land in a place that looks like the future. Gleaming terminals, a world-class metro system built in the years before the 2022 World Cup. The Museum of Islamic Art, an architectural masterpiece sitting on the waterfront, filled with treasures from across the Islamic world. Education City, where branch campuses of Georgetown, Carnegie Mellon, Cornell, and other American universities operate alongside each other on a purpose-built campus funded by the Qatar Foundation. Al Jazeera's headquarters, from which journalists broadcast to audiences across the Arab world and beyond. And everywhere, the towers and construction cranes of a country that is still, urgently and deliberately, building itself into something it did not used to be. The North Field's gas has been Qatar's foundation. The QIA's investments are its bridge to a post-gas future. The World Cup was its introduction to the world on the largest possible stage. The migrant worker reforms, however incomplete their critics consider them, represent at least a recognition that the system that built the country carries moral costs that the world is no longer willing to ignore in silence. Qatar National Vision 2030, the country's formal strategic plan, articulates goals for economic diversification, human development, and environmental sustainability. Whether those goals are achievable at the pace the gas wealth is also being consumed is a question that Qatar's planners study seriously. What Qatar's story forces the world to confront is a set of questions that most wealthy countries prefer to avoid. Who does a country's wealth actually belong to? When GDP per capita is calculated, whose experience does that number genuinely represent? Is the wealth generated by migrant labor genuinely national wealth? Or is it wealth generated on behalf of a group of people who are specifically excluded from sharing in it? These are not simple questions. They have no clean answers. But they are the questions that Qatar, by simply existing in the form it does, places before the global economy with remarkable precision. A peninsula that almost nobody had heard of 60 years ago, that scraped a living from pearl diving until the Japanese industrialized the pearl, that found oil and gas by geological accident, that built a global empire of wealth in less than a generation, now asks something uncomfortable of everyone watching. It asks whether the GDP number that makes it the world's richest country actually represents what most people mean when they say the word rich. For 300,000 people who were born into the right family, in the right country, in the right century, the answer is yes. For the 2.7 million others who built everything those 300,000 people now enjoy, the answer is considerably more complicated.